Imagine walking downward, not into darkness but into a deeper quiet. Picture stone steps worn smooth by centuries of passing feet, each step carrying the echo of a vow once spoken and never repeated aloud. The air is cool here, unmoving, as if it has been waiting. Somewhere behind these walls, it is said, memory was placed under seal, not destroyed but buried, as one might bury a flame to keep it from spreading. You are not here to uncover truth in the modern sense. You are here to listen, to trace the outlines of something that once existed at the edge of official memory. A collection of records, whispered of in fragments, Templar inventories that vanished, ledgers that did not return, symbols copied and recopied until their meanings softened into myth. The Knights Templar were once visible everywhere, on roads, in courts, in the margins of power, and then, almost without transition, they were gone. Their absence created a hollow space, and into that space drifted questions. What remains when an order is dissolved but its ideas linger? What survives when words are erased but the silence itself begins to speak? Tonight you are invited to walk slowly along that silence. Not to prove, not to accuse, but to observe how history sometimes folds inward, hiding its most fragile records beneath ritual, authority, and time. As the centuries pass in soft succession, the buried archive remains, not as an object but as a presence. And the deeper you listen, the more uncertain the ground beneath you becomes. Before anything was hidden, it first had to belong somewhere. Before secrecy, there was placement. Before silence, there was care. Imagine a Europe not yet settled into the shapes later centuries would recognize. The land does not feel ancient here, only patient. Forests press close to narrow roads, and villages seem temporary, as if they might quietly return to earth. Kingdoms are still learning their names. Authority is local, memory fragile, and the future uncertain enough to require deliberate preservation. Knowledge moves slowly in this world. It does not rush. It is carried by voices more often than by pages, passed from elder to novice, from priest to pupil, from traveler to host. Words are remembered because forgetting them would mean losing something that cannot easily be replaced. Writing exists, but it is precious, restrained, and deliberate. Now walk gently toward a monastery rising from open land. Its stones are pale, its walls thick, its windows narrow. Inside, time behaves differently. Days are measured by bells, nights by the steady breathing of those who keep vigil. This is where memory begins to rest its weight upon material things. In the scriptorium, light falls softly across wooden desks. Hands move slowly, copying letter by letter. Ink is mixed with care. Parchment is scraped, stretched, prepared as if it were already aware of its responsibility. Each page represents labor, patience, and intention. Nothing written here is casual. To record something in this world is to choose it. There is no illusion of completeness. The monks know they cannot save everything. They preserve what seems necessary for prayer, for order, for continuity. Sacred texts are copied faithfully, again and again, until their words become familiar companions. Rules of life, calendars, and commentaries form the backbone of what survives. But alongside these, other writings appear more quietly. Charters confirming land grants, letters between distant authorities, accounts that track obligations across years, fragments of older languages imperfectly translated, their meanings softened by time. These texts are not read aloud daily. Some are handled rarely. Some are stored apart. An archive here is not a single room. It is a pattern of decisions. Certain documents are placed where many hands may reach them. Others are wrapped, sealed, entrusted to specific keepers. This is not done out of fear, but out of respect for what those words can do. A misread charter could ignite conflict. A misplaced record could dissolve an agreement held together only by memory and trust. Secrecy in this early medieval world is not yet dramatic. It is practical. It is careful. It is understood as a form of stewardship. Walk now among shelves that are never full. Notice the gaps where texts once rested or perhaps never arrived at all. Absence is familiar here. Fire, damp, war, and neglect shape collections as much as devotion does. What survives is never the whole story, only the part that endured. This selective memory does not trouble those who live within it. It is expected. History, as they experience it, is already incomplete. And so, long before any later order would inherit these habits, the foundations are laid. Knowledge is valuable. Memory is fragile. Not everything should travel freely. Not everything should remain visible forever. This is the world before the seal. A world already accustomed to careful placement, quiet custodianship, and the slow shaping of silence. Memory, once placed into form, must be guarded. And guarding in this world is an act of faith. As monasteries spread across the landscape, they did more than pray and copy scripture. They became quiet anchors for continuity in a time when almost nothing felt permanent. Roads shifted, lords changed, borders dissolved and reappeared under new names. Yet within stone walls, records remained still, holding together agreements that outlived the people who made them. To step deeper into these early archives is to understand that writing here is never neutral. Every document carries consequence. A charter affirms authority. A list of obligations defines loyalty. A letter preserves a promise long after the speaker's voice has faded. Because of this, access matters. Not everyone may enter the archive. Not everyone who enters may read. Not everyone who reads may decide. Knowledge is layered carefully, like stone laid atop stone. Each layer supports the next, and removing one too quickly risks collapse. This is why some texts are placed apart. You are invited to picture a small chest bound with iron, resting not in a library but in a treasury room. Inside are documents that tie land to lineage, wealth to vow, power to obligation. These writings are not hidden because they are forbidden. They are protected because they are binding. In the medieval mind, words do not merely describe reality. They participate in it. A written agreement holds force because it endures beyond memory. It speaks when no one is present to explain it. This endurance makes writing powerful, and power demands care. So archivists emerge as a distinct kind of witness. Often unnamed, rarely remembered, they serve not as creators of history but as its keepers. Their task is quiet, to ensure that what has been entrusted does not drift, does not decay, does not fall into careless hands. This role is neither dramatic nor celebrated. It is understood as duty. Secrecy grows naturally from this duty. A document restricted to one keeper is not erased from the world. It is stabilized. It is held in place, like a stone set into a wall where it cannot easily be dislodged. You may notice how different this is from later imaginings of hidden knowledge. Here, concealment is not meant to obscure truth from the world, but to prevent truth from being fractured by misunderstanding. Languages shift, meanings change. What is clear to one generation may confuse the next. Archivists understand this. They know that some writings require context to survive intact. Without that context, preservation itself becomes a form of distortion. And so silence is sometimes chosen over circulation. This choice is rarely written down. It leaves no dramatic trace. It appears later only as absence, as a document referenced once and never again, as a ledger that ends without conclusion. These absences are not alarming to those who live among them. They are simply part of how memory behaves. As you remain here, notice how this culture does not fear loss but expects it. Preservation is never total. It is selective, guided by necessity, shaped by humility. The archive is not a mirror of the world but a narrowing lens. And in narrowing, it creates the conditions for later mystery. Because when future generations search for something missing, they often assume removal. They imagine force where there was restraint. They suspect intention where there was patience. But in this earlier world, the groundwork is quieter. Knowledge is placed. Knowledge is guarded. Knowledge is allowed at times to rest unseen. This is not erasure. It is custody. And it is from within this understanding that later orders will inherit not only records, but responsibility. Silence in this world is not emptiness. It is space left intentionally. As generations pass, the early medieval archive does not grow louder. It grows heavier. Documents accumulate slowly, but meanings thin. Hands that once knew why a record mattered are replaced by hands that know only how to preserve it. Context fades first. Explanation follows. What remains is form without voice. You are invited to imagine a document resting undisturbed for decades. Its ink remains dark, its seal intact. Yet no one reads it anymore, not because it is forbidden, but because its urgency has passed. The agreement it recorded has already reshaped the land. The names it contains belong to people long buried. Its purpose has fulfilled itself and fallen quiet. This is how disappearance often begins, not with destruction, but with completion. In this culture, a text does not need to be removed to vanish from memory. It needs only to stop being necessary. When that happens, it remains physically present but intellectually absent, drifting into a kind of historical sleep. Over time, these sleeping records multiply. Languages continue to shift like rivers changing course. Latin holds for a while, then bends under local tongues. Marginal notes become harder to read. References assume knowledge no longer shared. A document survives, but its meaning fractures into guesswork. Archivists notice this. They understand that preservation alone cannot guarantee understanding. Sometimes, allowing a text to rest undisturbed is safer than circulating it without its original frame of meaning. And so, silence becomes a companion to memory. This silence is not feared. It is accepted as part of stewardship. The past cannot be endlessly explained without distortion. Some things must be carried forward quietly, even if they are not actively used. Notice how this shapes institutional behavior. Archives are not designed for discovery. They are designed for continuity. Their purpose is not to reveal everything, but to ensure that what matters most does not vanish entirely. This means some materials remain untouched, waiting for a moment that may never come. As centuries unfold, this pattern hardens into tradition. What is often consulted becomes visible history. What is rarely consulted becomes shadow history, not secret but recessed. When later generations encounter these recesses, they sense something missing without knowing why. A reference points to a source no longer discussed. A list implies a larger collection never seen. Silence itself begins to suggest weight. But here, at this early stage, there is no drama attached to that weight. The world before the seal does not imagine future suspicion. It does not anticipate later curiosity. It simply does what it must to survive instability. Memory is handled carefully. Knowledge is placed with intention. Absence is tolerated without anxiety. This is the inheritance passed forward. So when much later, an order will rise that moves confidently across borders, that handles wealth, land, and trust on a scale unseen before, it will not invent secrecy. It will step into an already existing relationship with silence. The mystery you sense later does not begin with sudden erasure. It begins here, in a world that already understands that not all records speak forever. As you rest in this understanding, the foundations are complete. The conditions are set. The quiet has been prepared. And ahead, another chapter waits, where these habits are taken up, expanded, and carried into wider influence. Before the image of armor hardens in the mind, before banners and dust and the sound of hooves, there is a table. Picture it simply, wood worn smooth by years of contact, light entering through a narrow window, falling across parchment rather than steel. Hands rest here not in readiness for combat but in patience. Fingers trace lines of ink. Seals are pressed. Lists are checked, then checked again. This is where the story of the Knights Templar must first be allowed to settle. They arrive into a world already accustomed to careful memory. A world where archives matter, where trust is built not only through oaths but through records that endure beyond a single lifetime. The Templars do not invent this system. They step into it and expand it quietly. You are invited to imagine the early years of the order when its purpose is still narrowly defined. Protection of pilgrims, stewardship of roots, presence along dangerous roads that link sacred destinations. Yet almost immediately, something else begins to grow alongside these duties. Paperwork. Pilgrims entrust valuables to the Templars for safekeeping. Lords grant land. Kings recognize reliability. Each act of trust leaves behind a trace, a receipt, a charter, a record of obligation. What begins as service becomes custodianship. The Templars learn to keep accounts not because they seek power, but because power is placed into their hands. Wealth moves through them. Property passes under their care. Messages travel with their protection. To manage this flow, memory must become structured. So the tables multiply. In commanderies scattered across Europe, rooms are set aside for storage and writing. Ledgers appear. Inventories are updated. Charters are copied and sealed. These spaces do not feel secret. They feel orderly. The work done here is slow, repetitive, and essential. The order's strength lies not only in discipline of body, but in discipline of record. Across borders, the Templars maintain consistency. A donation recorded in one region can be recognized in another. An obligation acknowledged in one language is confirmed in the next. This reliability makes their system attractive to those navigating a fragmented political world. You begin to sense how their archive grows not through ambition, but through demand. As trust accumulates, so does documentation. The Templars become intermediaries between distant powers. They safeguard deeds, manage estates, and track resources that stretch across kingdoms. Their written footprint expands alongside their geographic reach. Yet nothing here is dramatic. There are no warnings sounded, no suspicions voiced. The archive grows as a natural response to responsibility. Each document reinforces the next. Each record confirms the order's usefulness. But with usefulness comes quiet influence. The Templars see patterns others do not. They witness the movement of wealth, the shifting priorities of rulers, the fragile balance between devotion and ambition. Their records reflect this, not in commentary but in accumulation. You are invited to notice how power leaves traces even when unspoken. A ledger does not judge. A charter does not accuse. But together, they form a map of authority that few others can see in its entirety. This map exists not in a single place, but across a network of fortified houses and administrative rooms, each holding a fragment of a larger whole. For now, this fragmentation protects as much as it reveals. The order remains focused outward. Its attention is on service, logistics, protection. The archive exists to support these aims, nothing more. It is functional, restrained, and trusted. Yet trust, once given widely, creates weight. And weight, even when carried quietly, begins to draw notice. For the moment, however, there is only stillness. The calm of routine. The soft sound of parchment turning. The tables remain steady. The swords rest untouched. As the years pass, the tables grow more numerous. Not larger, just more widely placed. You are invited to move slowly across the map now, not by roads but by records. A charter signed in northern France finds its counterpart acknowledged months later in Iberia. A deposit entrusted in one city is reclaimed in another, its journey tracked not by memory alone, but by careful notation. This is something new in its scale, though it does not announce itself as such. The Templars become a connective tissue in a divided world. Their houses are fortified, yes, but within those walls the most enduring defenses are shelves, chests, and ledgers. Documents are sorted by region, by obligation, by type. Seals are catalogued. Dates are cross-checked. What is promised in one place must be honored elsewhere, or the system fails. This consistency builds confidence. Kings and nobles begin to rely on the order not merely for protection, but for continuity. Land grants are deposited for safekeeping. Revenues are managed across distances that would otherwise make oversight impossible. Pilgrims travel lighter, knowing their resources can be retrieved when needed. Each of these services leaves behind another layer of writing. The archive expands across languages and customs. Latin remains the spine, but local terms creep in, adapting the system to regional realities. The Templars do not erase difference, they organize around it. Their records become bridges, translating obligation from one political context to another. You begin to sense the quiet uniqueness of this arrangement. Most institutions of the time operate within narrow boundaries. Their records reflect local concerns, local authority, local memory. The Templars, by contrast, accumulate fragments from many spheres. They do not control them, but they hold them together. This position makes them witnesses. They see the flow of resources toward certain regions. They note which routes grow safer and which fall into neglect. They observe how devotion intersects with ambition, how gifts are sometimes expressions of faith, sometimes calculations of influence. None of this is written as commentary. It does not need to be. The records speak indirectly. Patterns emerge only when viewed together, and few are able or authorized to see them together. Within commanderies, archivists work methodically. Their role is still uncelebrated. They are not strategists. They do not shape policy. Yet they maintain the structure that allows the order to function seamlessly across vast distances. Trust continues to accumulate, not because the Templars seek it, but because they do not betray it. And yet, something subtle begins to change. As the archive grows, it begins to represent more than administration. It becomes a reflection of influence. Those who understand its scope may begin to realize that the order holds not just assets, but insight. Still, this realization is not yet widespread. For most, the archive remains invisible. It is encountered only when needed, a transaction confirmed, a promise fulfilled, a journey made easier. The system works quietly, and so it attracts little scrutiny. But quiet systems, when they endure long enough, become assumptions. And assumptions, once noticed, can shift into questions. For now, the order continues its work unchanged. Ledgers are updated, inventories are revised, charters are copied and sealed. Each action reinforces the same impression: reliability, restraint, order. The weight of the archive increases, but it is evenly distributed across the network. No single house holds everything. No single keeper understands the whole. This diffusion protects the system. Yet diffusion also means that no one can easily explain the full extent of what exists. The archive becomes larger than any individual, larger even than intention. And so it rests quietly behind stone walls. Not yet a source of concern, not yet an object of focus, but no longer insignificant. The calm continues, but it is no longer unnoticed. By the time the archive reaches its fullest breadth, it does so without announcement. There is no moment when the Knights Templar pause to consider what they have become custodians of. The accumulation happens gradually, shaped by routine rather than ambition. Each new record arrives because something has been entrusted. Each is accepted because refusal would break the pattern of reliability the order has come to embody. You are invited now to move through a commandery at rest. The walls are thick. The air is cool. Light enters sparingly, illuminating chests bound with iron and shelves lined with parchment. Ledgers are stacked in careful order, their covers worn from use, their pages dense with handwriting. There is no sense of secrecy here, only containment. These records do not speak loudly. They do not declare meaning. They simply exist, holding together agreements that stretch across years and borders. Within them are the traces of countless interactions, gifts given in faith, lands transferred in trust, roots secured through cooperation. Nothing here appears dangerous. Yet weight does not require drama to be felt. As the archive grows, so too does its symbolic presence. Without intending to, the Templars become a memory bank for a fragmented world. They remember what others cannot hold alone. They preserve continuity where political structures falter. This role places them in a position, both visible and strangely undefined. Those who interact with the order trust it implicitly, yet few consider the totality of what it holds. The archive remains dispersed, protected by its own scale. No single ledger reveals its significance. No single house explains its reach. But institutions notice patterns even when individuals do not. Slowly, awareness begins to shift, not toward suspicion, but toward recognition. Recognition that the order's reliability rests upon something unseen. Recognition that behind the familiar image of discipline and service lies a structure of memory unlike any other of its time. Still, nothing is challenged. The Templars continue to serve. Their records continue to accumulate. The archive does not change in character, only in gravity. It becomes heavier without becoming louder. And heaviness, when unacknowledged, creates stillness. This stillness marks the end of the chapter. Not a climax, but a pause. A moment where everything remains exactly as it has been, even as its meaning quietly shifts. The calm persists. The trust remains intact. The records stay where they are. But attention, once it begins to turn inward, rarely does so without consequence. For now, the archive rests behind stone walls. Not hidden, not revealed, simply held. And ahead lies a different movement. Not of expansion, but of deviation, where symbols begin to appear, where patterns feel less straightforward, and where quiet questions begin to surface. Not all writing is meant to be read in the same way. Some words instruct, some words record, and some marks simply remain. You are invited now to move closer, not toward revelation but toward detail, toward the margins rather than the center, toward what appears incidental yet persists across pages and places. In the Templar archive, much looks familiar. Dates align, accounts balance, names appear where names are expected. At first glance, the records behave exactly as they should, administrative, functional, precise. And then gently, something feels slightly uneven. A symbol appears where a word might suffice. A phrase repeats with unusual consistency, even when context shifts. An inventory lists objects carefully counted, yet offers no description of their purpose. These are not errors. They are not corrections. They are simply there. Nothing here announces meaning. Medieval record-keeping allows for this. The boundary between administration and reflection is not sharply drawn. A document may confirm a transaction while also echoing a devotional pattern. Numbers may serve accounting and symbolism at once. Language often carries weight beyond instruction. You are asked to imagine a scribe pausing before adding a familiar mark to the margin. He does not explain it. He does not need to. Within his world, explanation lives elsewhere, perhaps in shared understanding, perhaps in oral tradition, perhaps in repetition itself. These deviations do not disrupt the record, they accompany it. A cross placed beside a name. A symbol repeated at the end of unrelated entries. A phrase that returns, unchanged, across different houses. To the original keepers, these marks may have felt natural, even invisible. To later readers, they linger. The chapter does not ask you to decode them. It asks you to notice how meaning behaves when it is not anchored, how symbols, once separated from their moment, begin to drift. In the medieval mind, symbolism is not decoration. It is language. It compresses meaning into form, allowing complex ideas to travel without exposition. This efficiency serves memory well until memory itself begins to thin. As time passes, the symbols remain while context fades. You are invited to walk among documents handled by many generations. Some keepers understand the marks intuitively. Others copy them faithfully without fully grasping their resonance. Still others ignore them altogether, focused only on the practical content of the text. This layered handling creates quiet divergence. The record remains intact, but its interpretation shifts subtly with each hand that touches it. Meaning does not disappear, it refracts. This is how ambiguity enters without force. No doctrine is hidden here. No secret teaching is required. What you witness is far gentler, the natural consequence of symbolic language surviving longer than its original audience. The archive begins to feel less like a fixed repository and more like a reflective surface. Each reader sees something slightly different, not because the text changes, but because they do. And so, even before any external pressure arrives, the records themselves begin to behave differently across time. Not louder, not darker, just less certain. These quiet deviations do not alarm the order. They do not interrupt routine. The archive continues to function as intended. Transactions proceed. Trust holds. Yet beneath the surface, something subtle is unfolding. Meaning is loosening its grip on form. And when meaning loosens, space opens, not for danger but for interpretation. As you remain with these documents, another layer begins to emerge, not as discovery but as texture. Medieval writing often carries more than one intention at a time. A ledger can track resources while echoing sacred numerology. A phrase can fulfill legal precision while also resonating with devotional rhythm. These dual purposes are not hidden. They are simply assumed. The Templars inherit this tradition naturally. You are invited to imagine a record keeper trained not only in accounting, but in prayer. His mind moves easily between order and symbol, between calculation and contemplation. For him, these are not separate acts. They reinforce one another. A list of provisions may follow a pattern familiar from liturgical texts. A sequence of names may be arranged not alphabetically, but symbolically. These choices are not announced. They are embedded. Over time, such patterns become habits. They persist even as circumstances change. New scribes follow old forms without questioning them. Marks are repeated because repetition itself feels stabilizing. What once carried layered meaning slowly becomes formalized, then abstract. You begin to sense how a document can speak in two voices at once. On the surface, it fulfills its administrative role. Beneath that, it gestures toward something less concrete, a shared worldview, a way of ordering reality that blends the practical and the contemplative. This does not mean the Templars are encoding messages or concealing teachings. It means they are operating within a symbolic culture where meaning is often implicit rather than explained. But implicit meaning is fragile. When generations change, when training shifts, when language evolves, the balance between these two voices can slip. One is heard clearly, the other fades into uncertainty. This is where misunderstanding becomes possible, not because something was hidden, but because something was assumed. You are invited to imagine a later keeper encountering a familiar symbol whose original resonance has softened. He copies it carefully, honoring tradition, yet without full awareness of why it is there. The symbol survives, but its voice grows faint. Elsewhere, another keeper ignores it entirely, focused only on the transaction recorded. The archive continues to function, but unevenly. Not all layers are carried forward equally. Fragments accumulate. Some documents feel strangely complete yet unsatisfying, as if they point beyond themselves without revealing where. Others feel overdetermined, heavy with repetition whose purpose is no longer clear. This is not failure, it is inheritance under time. As these fragments spread across the network, they begin to behave differently in different places. A mark meaningful in one region becomes ornamental in another. A phrase recited with care in one house is treated as formula in the next. No correction is issued, no standardization imposed. The order tolerates variation because variation has always existed. Their strength lies in function, not uniform interpretation. Yet this tolerance allows ambiguity to deepen. The archive no longer speaks with a single rhythm. It breathes unevenly, shaped by local understanding, local emphasis, local memory. And still, nothing here is alarming. Ambiguity does not yet imply threat. It remains an internal texture, noticed perhaps by some, ignored by most. The records still do what they are meant to do. They support trust. They preserve continuity. But they also begin to invite projection. Later readers, encountering these fragments without their original context, will sense intention where there was habit, secrecy where there was symbolism, design where there was devotion. This chapter does not confirm such readings. It asks you to sit with the moment before they arise. A moment when meaning is still flexible, when symbols are still quiet, when deviation has not yet become suspicion. The archive at this stage is neither dangerous nor revealing. It is simply layered. And layered things, when viewed from a distance, can appear deeper than they are, or deeper than anyone ever intended. There comes a point, not marked by event nor recorded in ink, when symbols begin to outlive the hands that placed them. You are invited to linger here, in that gentle transition. The Templar archive continues its daily work. Records are maintained. Inventories are checked. Correspondence moves steadily along familiar routes. Nothing has been disrupted. And yet beneath this continuity, meaning has begun to loosen its hold. Not disappear. Not collapse. Simply drift. A symbol once added with care now feels habitual. A repeated phrase, once reflective, becomes procedural. An unexplained object listed in an inventory remains listed long after anyone remembers why it was ever included. The archive holds these things faithfully, but without commentary. This is how mirrors are made. As generations of keepers encounter these fragments, they bring their own expectations to them. One sees devotion, another sees administration, a third senses omission. The document itself does not correct them. It offers no defense. Meaning becomes relational. What the record reflects depends increasingly on who is looking and when. You are asked to imagine a later reader, separated by decades or centuries, encountering the archive without the quiet assumptions that once guided it. He notices the repetitions. He pauses at the symbols. He wonders why certain items are named but not described. He does not accuse. He wonders. And wondering is powerful. Not because it reveals truth, but because it creates space. Space where interpretation can gather. Space where absence begins to feel intentional, even if it never was. This is the moment where ambiguity deepens, not through addition, but through distance. The medieval world understood symbols as shared language, but shared languages fracture when communities shift. What once required no explanation begins to invite it, and when explanation is unavailable, imagination fills the gap. The archive, unchanged in form, begins to feel changed in tone. It is no longer just a tool. It is an artifact. And artifacts are read differently than records. They are approached with curiosity rather than familiarity. Their silence is treated as suggestion rather than completion. Still, within the order, daily life continues undisturbed. The Templars do not pause to reinterpret their own documents. They trust the continuity of practice. They assume understanding persists where it once did. This assumption is not negligence, it is human. Institutions rarely notice meaning fading until it is gone. They preserve structure because structure is visible. Interpretation, by contrast, fades quietly. And so the archive grows increasingly reflective. It shows each observer a version of themselves, what they expect to find, what they are prepared to see, what unsettles them when it remains unanswered. No hidden doctrine is required for this transformation. No secret teaching needs to exist. The mystery forms naturally, through time and reinterpretation. The chapter rests here, in this subtle shift. Not in danger, not in revelation, but in uncertainty that has not yet learned its own weight. The records are still trusted. The order is still respected. The archive still functions. Yet something has changed in how it can be perceived. What was once clearly practical now carries echoes. What was once symbolic now feels unresolved. What was once familiar now invites quiet attention. This is not the beginning of conflict. It is the beginning of perception. And perception, once altered, rarely returns unchanged. Ahead lies a widening horizon, where the archive spreads across lands and seas, where its fragments are carried farther from their point of origin, and where institutions larger than the order itself begin to take notice. For now, the symbols remain where they have always been. The deviations stay quiet. The mirror holds. As the world opens outward, memory follows. The Knights Templar do not expand suddenly. Their reach lengthens slowly, like a tide that returns again and again to the same shore, each time settling a little farther inland. What begins in familiar regions extends outward, across mountains, across waters, across borders that exist more in custom than in certainty. With this expansion, the archive begins to move. You are invited to picture documents traveling the same routes as people and goods, charters folded carefully and carried across valleys, letters sealed and entrusted to ships bound for eastern ports, inventories copied before departure, then copied again upon arrival. Memory no longer rests in one place. It circulates. From northern France to Iberia, Templar houses adapt to local conditions. From the British Isles to the Mediterranean coast, records are shaped by climate, language, and custom. Each house maintains what it needs, copies what it must, and references what lies elsewhere. This movement is practical, it is necessary, and it changes everything. An archive that travels cannot remain singular. Originals stay behind while copies move forward. Copies, over time, begin to differ, not dramatically but subtly. A phrase shortens. A symbol is rendered slightly differently. A reference assumes familiarity that does not exist in the new place. None of this feels dangerous. It feels alive. You are asked to imagine a record keeper in a coastal commandery receiving documents from afar. He recognizes their form, but not every detail. He files them carefully, trusting their origin. Elsewhere, another keeper references those same documents without ever seeing them directly, relying on summaries and established trust. No one holds the full picture. This is not failure. It is design shaped by distance. The Templars do not seek centralization of memory. They seek functionality. Each house knows what it must know to operate. The rest exists somewhere else, held by others equally disciplined. The archive becomes a network rather than a vault. This network resists containment by its nature. You begin to sense how scale complicates preservation. What is dispersed cannot be gathered easily. What is referenced in many places cannot be removed from all of them at once. Even understanding becomes distributed, partial, localized. The archive no longer feels like an object. It feels like a presence. It moves with the order, adapting to geography and necessity. It reflects the rhythms of travel and exchange. Documents accompany relics, letters of credit, and sealed instructions. Memory becomes mobile. And with mobility comes divergence. A record copied in one region may survive even if its original is lost elsewhere. A reference in one ledger may point to a document no longer accessible to that house. Over time, the archive begins to contain gaps that are not empty, but misaligned. These gaps are not yet noticed as such. They are simply part of operating across distance. No one expects perfect alignment. No one requires it. Yet as the network grows, the sense of totality fades. There is no longer a place where the archive can be said to exist in full. It lives instead across routes, across shelves, across memory held by many hands. Each fragment is complete in itself, yet incomplete in relation to the whole. This is the cost of expansion and its quiet strength. Because what cannot be gathered cannot be easily erased. And still time begins its patient work. Copies wear out, roots change, some houses flourish, others fade, memory remains present but uneven. The chapter pauses here, at the moment when scale begins to shape mystery, not through concealment but through distance. The records continue to travel. The network continues to hold. And silence begins to stretch across the spaces in between. As the archive spreads, something subtle is lost, not in content but in orientation. You are invited to imagine a system with no single heart. Each Templar house maintains its own rhythm, its own shelves, its own priorities shaped by geography and circumstance. What matters in a coastal port differs from what matters inland. What must be recorded in a border region is not the same as what is preserved near a royal court. And yet, all of it belongs to the same network. Documents move outward, but authority does not consolidate inward. There is no master archive where everything returns. Instead, memory circulates, trusting that overlap will provide continuity. References link to other references. Copies gesture toward originals that may be hundreds of miles away. This creates a peculiar kind of stability. The system does not rely on total visibility. It relies on shared practice. Each keeper knows how to maintain records, even if they do not know every record that exists. The structure holds because everyone follows the same discipline, not because anyone oversees the whole. You begin to sense how this resists simple control. To understand the full scope of the archive, one would need to travel extensively, compare documents across regions, reconcile variations, and interpret silences. Few have the authority or the inclination to do so. Most interact only with the fragments relevant to their immediate needs. This fragmentation is not a flaw, it is functional. It allows the order to operate flexibly across shifting political landscapes. If one house falls, others continue. If one record is lost, another copy may persist elsewhere. Yet fragmentation also introduces complexity. A reference in a ledger may point to a document no longer present in that location. A copy may survive without its original context. Over time, these dislocations accumulate. The archive remains intact in pieces, but increasingly difficult to grasp as a whole. You are invited to notice how this changes perception. An archive without a center cannot easily explain itself. It does not present a single narrative. It offers many partial ones, each shaped by local memory. To those outside the system, this can feel opaque, not because something is hidden, but because nothing is gathered. Scale deepens ambiguity. As the Templars' reach extends into the Eastern Mediterranean, records encounter new cultures, new administrative traditions, new symbolic languages. Documents are translated, summarized, adapted. Each translation preserves function while subtly altering tone. Meaning shifts almost imperceptibly. A term precise in one context becomes approximate in another. A symbol familiar in the West is treated as ornamental in the East. These differences are not corrected. They are absorbed into practice. The archive becomes layered not only across space, but across interpretation. No single authority intervenes to unify these layers. The order values reliability over uniformity. As long as obligations are met and trust maintained, variation is tolerated. And so the archive grows increasingly resistant to simplification. Later, when questions arise about what existed where, answers will be partial. One house will remember one thing, another will remember differently. Both will be correct within their own context. This multiplicity does not feel threatening, yet. For now, it remains an internal texture, noticed perhaps by those who travel widely, but invisible to most. The system continues to function. The records continue to serve their purpose. But you are invited to sense how disappearance becomes more complex within this network. To remove something entirely would require more than force. It would require time, patience, and the quiet cooperation of distance. It would require allowing references to outlast originals, copies to drift from sources, memory to thin without intervention. In such a system, fatting becomes easier than erasure. And fatting leaves fewer marks. The chapter lingers here, within this distributed stillness. The archive remains extensive, yet elusive. Present everywhere, yet complete nowhere. The sea routes continue to carry documents alongside goods and relics. The land routes continue to bind distant houses together. And between them, silence stretches, not as absence but as space. As the years continue their quiet passage, the archive does not diminish. It becomes diffuse. You are invited to imagine time moving not as a force that destroys, but as one that redistributes. Houses rise and fall, roots shift, priorities change, yet fragments of the Templar record persist, scattered across regions that no longer share the same rhythms. A ledger remains in one place long after its corresponding document has been moved elsewhere. A reference survives in a copy, while the original rests forgotten in a different house. No single moment marks these separations. They accumulate slowly through ordinary decisions. This is how scale begins to produce silence. The larger the network grows, the more its memory relies on trust rather than oversight. No keeper is tasked with reconciliation across the whole. No central authority intervenes to restore alignment. The system works because it does not attempt to see itself fully. And so disappearance becomes passive. What fades does not do so because it is removed. It fades because it is no longer encountered. A document that remains valid but irrelevant is left untouched. A copy that serves its purpose is not refreshed. A reference that no longer resolves is not pursued. These are not acts of neglect. They are consequences of scale. You are asked to consider how difficult it would be to erase something in such a system, not because it is well defended, but because it is everywhere and nowhere at once. To remove every trace would require coordination across distances, languages, and jurisdictions. Instead, time performs the work quietly. Records remain physically present, yet disconnected. Meaning persists, yet without coherence. The archive survives as fragments rather than as a unified whole. Silence fills the spaces between them. Later observers encountering these fragments will sense loss without knowing its origin. They will find references without sources, copies without originals, symbols without explanation. The archive will feel incomplete, even though much of it still exists. This incompleteness will invite speculation, not because something was deliberately hidden, but because fragmentation feels intentional to those who expect order. But here at this stage, there is no intention to conceal. The order continues its work. The records continue to travel. The network remains functional. What has changed is not behavior but perception, perception shaped by distance and time. Scale has transformed clarity into quiet. What cannot be gathered cannot be fully understood. What cannot be fully understood begins to feel absent. And absence, once noticed, becomes fertile ground for mystery. The chapter rests here, not on loss but on dispersion, not on erasure but on endurance without coherence. The Templar archive remains vast. It also remains unreachable in its entirety. And this unreachable quality will matter later. When attention turns inward, when institutions seek order, and when silence is no longer merely tolerated, but questioned. For now, the sea carries documents alongside cargo. The land carries memory from house to house. And between them, the archive lingers. Too large to grasp, too scattered to erase, and already beginning to fade. There is no sound when it happens. No single moment that announces itself as an ending. The world simply slows. You are invited to arrive here gently, at the point history later marks with certainty, but which, in its own time, felt administrative rather than dramatic. Orders are delivered. Doors are opened. Familiar routines pause. The movement that once carried messages, goods, and records across land and sea settles into stillness. The Knights Templar are arrested, but this chapter does not dwell on the spectacle of it. Armor and accusation remain at the edges. What matters here is what follows after the noise recedes. Paper does not resist. Ledgers do not protest. Records wait. You walk now through rooms that once held rhythm. Tables where entries were updated daily now sit untouched. Shelves that once received new documents receive none. The archive, long accustomed to motion, must learn how to remain still. Authority shifts quietly. Royal officials arrive with lists. Ecclesiastical representatives bring seals. The language of trust is replaced with the language of review. Records are no longer maintained for continuity, but examined for clarity. What once existed to support function is now asked to justify itself. This change is subtle but profound. Documents are gathered not all at once, not everywhere, but steadily. Some are seized outright. Others are requested, copied, summarized. Each interaction alters the archive's posture. It is no longer living memory. It becomes evidence, inventory, inheritance. You are invited to notice how quickly purpose reshapes value. A ledger once essential to daily operation is now redundant. A correspondence once active is now historical. A record whose meaning was shared implicitly must now be interpreted by those unfamiliar with its context. This is where thinning begins. Not through destruction, but through reassignment. Some records are absorbed seamlessly into royal systems. Land deeds are refiled. Financial accounts are reconciled and merged. Documents that align easily with existing frameworks are preserved because they remain useful. Others do not align so easily. A reference without a corresponding document raises no alarm. It is noted, or not, and set aside. A ledger whose relevance depends on a network no longer functioning becomes static. Without the system that animated it, its meaning dims. Institutional processes unfold without urgency. There is no need for haste. The order is no longer operating. Time is available. Inventories are rewritten. Categories change. Priorities shift toward clarity, ownership, and control. What cannot be quickly understood is simplified. What resists simplification is delayed. Delayed things often fade. You walk through corridors where documents change hands repeatedly. Each transfer introduces the possibility of loss, not dramatic loss, but administrative loss. A page misplaced, a bundle left uncopied, a reference deemed unnecessary. No one intends this. It is not malice, it is procedure. Institutions preserve what fits. They set aside what does not. And so the archive, once vast and distributed, begins to contract, not in size but in relevance. Its edges soften, its redundancies disappear, its quieter fragments lose advocates. The stillness deepens. The chapter rests here, in this pause where activity has ceased but consequences have not yet settled. The records remain present, but their future is uncertain. They are no longer protected by use. What follows will not be sudden. It will be gradual, and it will be shaped by process rather than intent. The stillness does not remain empty for long. It fills with movement of a different kind. You are invited to walk now through corridors where footsteps echo softly, where documents are carried not with familiarity, but with caution. The archive is no longer in motion by its own rhythm. It is being moved by others, each with a different mandate. Tables are cleared, chests are opened, seals are inspected, then replaced with new ones. What was once held in trust is now held under authority. The distinction is quiet but unmistakable. Records are sorted. Some are immediately recognized as useful. Land grants pass cleanly into royal registries. Financial accounts are reviewed, their balances confirmed, their relevance preserved. These documents speak a language the new custodians understand. They fit established categories. They are absorbed with little resistance. Others hesitate. A ledger whose meaning depends on roots no longer maintained is set aside. A correspondence that assumes shared knowledge across distant houses feels incomplete when read in isolation. A record written for continuity rather than scrutiny resists quick interpretation. These documents are not destroyed. They are deferred. Deferral is subtle. It does not announce itself as loss. A bundle is placed in temporary storage. A reference is noted but not pursued. A copy is made of the parts deemed relevant, leaving the rest behind. You are asked to notice how easily this happens within institutional systems. Time is finite. Attention is selective. Processes are designed to resolve, not to preserve complexity. What cannot be resolved efficiently becomes peripheral. Inventories are rewritten with new priorities. Where once records were organized by function within a living network, they are now reorganized by ownership and clarity. Redundancies are eliminated. Overlaps are simplified. This simplification is not careless, it is thorough. Yet thoroughness has its own cost. When a record exists primarily to support a system that no longer functions, its value becomes difficult to articulate. Without advocates who understand its context, it becomes optional. Optional things do not command resources, so they remain untouched. Over time, untouched things become invisible. You walk past rooms where documents sit quietly, no longer handled, no longer referenced. Their ink remains. Their seals endure, but their role has ended. They are no longer part of any active process. This is how archives thin without violence. Not by tearing pages, but by ceasing to turn them. Some materials pass into ecclesiastical care, where preservation follows different priorities. Others are absorbed into royal archives, where political utility guides survival. A few remain in limbo, neither integrated nor discarded. No one stands over these choices with a sense of drama. They unfold through routine decisions made by many individuals, each acting reasonably within their role. The result is cumulative. The archive loses density, connections dissolve, references point nowhere. What remains appears orderly but narrower than what once existed. Later, this narrowing will feel like erasure, but here, in this moment, it feels like organization. The stillness deepens, not because nothing is happening, but because what is happening is quiet and impersonal. The chapter lingers here, in this administrative twilight. The Templar archive is not gone. It is being reshaped by hands that did not build it, according to needs it was never designed to serve. What will remain is uncertain. What will fade is already beginning to do so. And ahead, the process continues. Slower now, steadier, and increasingly silent. What remains after movement ends is not emptiness, but residue. You are invited to stay a little longer in this quiet aftermath, where the work of institutions continues without spectacle. The arrest of the Templars has already passed into record. What unfolds now does not draw attention, yet it shapes memory far more enduringly. The archive continues to thin. Not because someone wills it to vanish, but because it no longer stands at the center of any living system. Records once sustained by daily use now exist only as remnants. Without repetition, without renewal, they settle into stillness. You walk through rooms where bundles of documents rest untouched. No one has decided against them. They simply no longer answer a question anyone is asking. Their relevance has dissolved, even as their form remains. This is how procedure completes its work. Institutions are designed to move forward. They resolve uncertainty by narrowing focus. What cannot be integrated is not opposed, it is bypassed. Complexity gives way to clarity. Silence replaces explanation. Over time, references within surviving documents lose their anchors. A charter mentions an earlier agreement now absent. A ledger assumes a network no longer functioning. These gaps are not filled, they are tolerated. Tolerance here is decisive. Because what is tolerated without use eventually ceases to matter. A document preserved but never consulted is preserved only in name. Its influence ends quietly. You are asked to notice how little effort this requires. No one must hide anything. No one must destroy anything. Time combined with administrative habit is sufficient. As records pass through successive hands, each custodian inherits a narrower version of what once existed. What they receive feels complete to them because it answers their needs. They cannot measure what is missing because they never knew it was there. This is the most effective form of disappearance. The archive becomes leaner, clearer, and more manageable. It also becomes less reflective of its original complexity. Layers that once overlapped, symbolic, logistical, relational, are flattened into categories that fit new systems of control. Later generations will encounter this streamlined record and sense something absent. They will see precision where texture once lived, order where networks once breathed. They may imagine force. They may imagine intention. But here, in this moment, there is only process. The mystery of the thinning archive is not one of cruelty or concealment. It is one of translation from one institutional logic to another. What cannot be translated fully is simplified. What resists simplification is left behind. And what is left behind grows quiet. The stillness that began with halted movement now deepens into permanence. The archive does not vanish. It settles. Its edges dissolve. Its center shifts. Some fragments will survive in unexpected places. Others will linger unseen. Many will fade without record of their fading. This is not an ending. It is a transformation. As you rest here, notice how silence has become structural. It is no longer a pause between actions. It is the condition that follows. Ahead lies a different kind of presence. Not the silence of procedure, but the silence of guardianship, where institutions inherit what remains, where preservation itself becomes selective, and where the archive is no longer questioned, only curated. For now, the corridors are quiet. The documents are still, and the thinning is complete enough to go unnoticed. What remains after transition is rarely examined all at once. It is received. You are invited to imagine the moment not as a confrontation, but as a quiet transfer. The Templar order has fallen still, and what survives of its records does not disappear into chaos. Instead, fragments move gently into existing structures already accustomed to carrying the weight of centuries. The Church does not inherit an archive in full. It inherits pieces. Bundles of documents arrive alongside land, buildings, and obligations. Some are immediately recognizable. Others feel unfamiliar in tone or structure, shaped by a system that no longer exists. The task now is not to uncover meaning, but to maintain continuity. Institutions that endure do so by ordering the past. Within ecclesiastical libraries, records are assessed not for mystery but for stability. What can be understood is preserved through copying. What fits within established frameworks is integrated. What does not is not rejected. It is set aside. This is not indifference. It is caution. The Church has long experience with fragile texts. It knows how easily meaning can fracture when removed from context. It has witnessed how speculation can arise from fragments, how interpretation can outrun intention. And so, restraint becomes a form of care. You are invited to walk through a library where shelves rise high and light falls softly. Access is limited, not because something is forbidden, but because tradition governs movement. Certain texts are handled only by those trained to read them. Others remain untranslated, waiting not for curiosity, but for necessity. Silence here is not emptiness. It is order. Some documents are copied because they continue to serve practical roles, confirming property, lineage, obligation. Others are preserved physically but not circulated intellectually. They are cataloged, stored, and left to rest. This dormancy is deliberate. To leave a text untranslated is not to deny its existence. It is to acknowledge that meaning, once lost, cannot be easily restored. Better to preserve form than to risk distortion through haste. You are asked to consider how often silence functions this way in long-lived institutions, not as concealment, but as protection. What cannot be safely interpreted is allowed to remain quiet. Over time, these quiet records recede further into the background. They are referenced obliquely, if at all. Their presence is known, but their contents are not central to ongoing life. They do not vanish. They wait. The Church does not seek to resolve every fragment it inherits. It seeks to prevent instability. Continuity depends on clarity, and clarity sometimes requires omission, not of existence, but of emphasis. In this way, the archive does not disappear through force. It disappears through patience. The absence of discussion becomes its own kind of presence. What is not spoken of acquires a gravity different from what is denied. Silence accumulates meaning simply by enduring. This chapter does not accuse. It observes. It invites you to sit with the idea that preservation and dormancy can be the same act, that to protect memory, institutions sometimes choose not to activate it, that silence, carefully maintained, can be a form of stewardship rather than loss. The mystery here does not deepen through secrecy. It deepens through time. And as the fragments rest within ordered shelves, their quiet grows more complete. As centuries pass, the fragments settle. You are invited to move deeper into the ecclesiastical spaces that inherit them, not as intruder but as observer. Libraries here are not designed for exploration. They are designed for endurance. Stone walls regulate temperature. Wooden shelves are arranged according to tradition rather than convenience. Time moves differently within them. Access is governed not by secrecy, but by role. Some rooms are entered daily, others only occasionally. Some texts are handled often enough that their margins grow soft. Others remain crisp, their pages rarely turned. These differences are not judgments of value. They reflect use. The Templar fragments find their place within this rhythm. A charter confirming land rights continues to be consulted. A ledger whose system no longer operates is preserved, but not activated. A document written in a style unfamiliar to later scribes remains untranslated, not because it is forbidden, but because it does not yet belong. You are asked to notice how dormancy becomes normalized. Silence is no longer temporary, it becomes structural. A text resting unused for generations acquires a different status. It is no longer part of active memory. It becomes archival memory, acknowledged but distant. This distance protects both the text and the institution. Speculation thrives on fragments. The Church understands this. It has witnessed how partial texts, removed from context, can destabilize belief and practice. Better, then, to limit engagement to what can be responsibly held. This restraint is not dramatic, it is procedural. Catalogs record existence without commentary. Shelf marks indicate location without interpretation. Knowledge is preserved materially while being held intellectually at arm's length. Over time, the absence of discussion becomes habitual. What is not spoken of is not questioned. Silence sustains itself. You walk past manuscripts whose origins are known only broadly. Their connection to the Templars is noted but not emphasized. They are part of the inheritance, not its center. As generations of custodians succeed one another, each inherits the same posture: respect for what exists, caution toward what is unclear, priority given to stability over inquiry. This continuity shapes perception. Later observers may mistake this silence for concealment. They may imagine deliberate suppression. But from within the institution, the silence feels protective. It prevents misunderstanding. It avoids unnecessary disturbance. It allows the present to function without being burdened by unresolved fragments. Dormant texts accumulate quietly. They do not disappear. They are simply no longer activated by need or curiosity. Their survival depends not on attention, but on infrastructure. This is how archives endure. Not by constant engagement, but by careful limitation. Not by explaining everything, but by preserving the possibility of future understanding. The Church becomes, in this sense, a curator of silence, not as an act of denial, but as an act of patience. It carries forward what it cannot yet interpret, trusting that time, rather than haste, will decide its relevance. The mystery here does not sharpen. It settles. It becomes layered, institutional, and slow. A silence that breathes with the building that holds it. And as this quiet deepens, the archive's presence grows less visible, yet more enduring. Silence, when sustained long enough, becomes a condition rather than a choice. You are invited to remain within this condition, to sense how dormancy shapes memory not by absence, but by restraint. The Templar fragments have not been erased. They have been absorbed into a system that prioritizes continuity over explanation. Within ecclesiastical archives, time is not measured in urgency. It is measured in survival. Texts are evaluated not for what they might reveal, but for how they might endure without causing fracture. What cannot be confidently situated is allowed to remain still. This stillness is deliberate, but not dramatic. A manuscript that resists translation is left untouched. A record whose context has faded is preserved without commentary. Its silence is not a verdict. It is a pause that extends across generations. You are asked to notice how this changes the nature of mystery. What is dormant invites imagination precisely because it does not respond. The absence of interpretation creates space, and space invites projection. Yet from within the institution, this is not perceived as loss. It is perceived as caution. The Church has learned that meaning forced too quickly can distort. Better to preserve the artifact intact than to activate it prematurely. Better to allow silence than to invite speculation. And so, the archive recedes further into the background. Catalogs grow, references become briefer. The fragments are acknowledged but not integrated into active discourse. They exist as part of the inheritance, not part of the narrative. This posture is consistent. It persists through reforms, through shifts in language, through changing intellectual climates. The silence is not reactive, it is stable. Later centuries will encounter this dormancy and interpret it through their own frameworks. They may see intention where there was patience. They may sense suppression where there was stewardship. But here in this chapter, the mystery is not one of conflict. It is one of temperament. Institutions that endure often learn to hold uncertainty without resolving it. They preserve what they cannot yet explain. They limit access not to obscure, but to protect against misunderstanding. The Templar archive in this sense does not vanish. It enters a long sleep. Its fragments remain safe, catalogued, and intact, yet rarely disturbed. Their silence grows heavier not because it is enforced, but because it is inherited. This inherited silence shapes everything that follows. When future generations search for clarity, they will encounter quiet instead. When they ask questions, they will find references without elaboration. The archive will feel present, yet unreachable. And that unreachable quality will define it more than any content ever could. As you rest here, the mystery settles into its institutional form. Layered, patient, and enduring. Ahead lies a different movement, not of preservation, but of echo, where silence gives rise to reflection, where absence becomes symbol, and where the archive begins to speak only through what remains unsaid. Centuries pass without announcement. Stone weathers, languages soften, institutions endure by changing slowly enough to appear unchanged. The Knights Templar no longer exist as an order, yet they do not vanish from memory. Their absence leaves a shape behind, and that shape begins to gather meaning of its own. You are invited now to move forward in time, not quickly, but patiently, watching how silence transforms into echo. Later generations encounter the Templars first as history, then as legend. Armor replaces administration. Trials eclipse archives. What once was ordinary record-keeping becomes distant and indistinct. And yet, traces remain. A brief reference in a chronicle. A marginal note in a catalog. A symbol repeated without explanation. These are not revelations, they are impressions. You are asked to notice how often these impressions appear indirectly. A document lists holdings formerly held by the order. A librarian records a manuscript's provenance without elaboration. A theologian alludes to traditions inherited but not examined. Each reference is small. None explains itself. Together they form a pattern, not of information but of remembrance. Absence begins to generate weight. The archive, now dormant, survives only in fragments that surface unpredictably. A record appears in one century, then disappears from mention in the next. A symbol resurfaces in a different context, stripped of its original function yet retaining its form. Later readers notice these inconsistencies. They sense discontinuity. They begin to ask not what existed, but why it no longer speaks. You are invited to observe how interpretation fills this space. Without access to a complete record, later generations rely on inference. They read silence as suggestion. They imagine coherence where fragmentation exists. The buried archive becomes a canvas, each era projecting its concerns upon it. In times of uncertainty, the silence feels ominous. In times of renewal, it feels symbolic. In times of reflection, it feels unresolved. The echoes do not clarify. They multiply. A reference suggests loss, but not what was lost. A revival borrows form without recovering meaning. An omission feels intentional, though it may simply be inherited. What remains constant is not knowledge, but curiosity. The mystery shifts here. It no longer resides in the archive itself, but in how the archive is remembered. Meaning detaches from content and attaches to continuity. The question becomes not what did the records contain, but why do they still matter enough to be mentioned? You are asked to sit with this question without answering it. Because each echo gestures backward without resolving anything. Each mention suggests something unfinished. The silence, once institutional, now becomes cultural. And culture listens differently. This chapter does not seek to correct later interpretations. It observes them forming. It watches how absence acquires narrative force simply by persisting. The archive does not return. It reflects. And as time continues its slow movement forward, these reflections will deepen. Not into clarity, but into layers of meaning, shaped by those who look back and wonder. As memory stretches across generations, it changes shape. You are invited to observe how the absence left by the Templars becomes increasingly active, not through evidence, but through imagination disciplined by tradition. The farther the archive recedes, the more its outline sharpens in the cultural mind. Later centuries encounter fragments without framework. A symbol carved into stone. A phrase preserved in a copied manuscript. A catalog entry that records possession without explanation. Each fragment stands alone. Without the systems that once gave them meaning, they invite interpretation rather than understanding. This is how legend begins, not through invention, but through inheritance of gaps. You are asked to notice how different eras approach these gaps differently. Scholars seek patterns. Chroniclers favor continuity. Artists borrow symbols stripped of administrative context, transforming them into metaphors. The Templars become vessels for whatever the age requires. In some periods, they are remembered as guardians of purity. In others, as warnings against excess. At times, they are romanticized. At times, moralized. Each interpretation reflects more about the interpreter than about the archive itself. The buried records do not correct these projections. Their silence allows them. This is not deception. It is the natural behavior of unresolved history. Catalogs compiled centuries later include cautious language. Provenance is noted without elaboration. Phrases such as once belonging to or formerly associated with appear, then stop. The absence of explanation becomes part of the description. These omissions feel intentional to those reading them later. They suggest choice, even when they reflect uncertainty or habit. You are invited to consider how easily absence is mistaken for concealment. When a narrative lacks resolution, the mind supplies motive. When records do not speak, speculation fills the quiet. The archive becomes less a collection of texts and more a symbolic space, one that can hold multiple, even contradictory meanings. Each revival of interest reshapes the echo. A symbol reused in one century is interpreted differently in the next. A story retold accumulates emphasis without adding information. The original fragments remain unchanged, but their framing evolves. What is consistent is not accuracy, but persistence. The Templars continue to matter because their story ends without closure. The archive remains buried not because it is hidden, but because it was never fully reassembled. Its incompleteness becomes its defining feature. Later generations sense this and respond accordingly. They do not seek answers. They seek significance. And significance is easier to project than to verify. This chapter does not validate these legends. It observes their formation. It notes how the absence of a complete archive allows memory to drift toward meaning rather than fact. The echoes do not point backward clearly. They reverberate outward. Each mention adds another layer to the silence, making it thicker, more textured, more suggestive. The archive becomes less about documents and more about what it represents, a break in continuity that cannot be repaired. And as long as that break remains, the echoes will continue to sound. Softly, indirectly, and without resolution. As time continues its slow, unmeasured movement, the echoes do not fade. They settle. You are invited to notice how the Templars, now distant enough to be reshaped by memory, become fixed not in fact but in feeling. The archive that once grounded their daily operations no longer anchors interpretation. What survives instead is an impression, something once substantial, now incomplete. Later centuries inherit this incompleteness without context. They encounter mentions without explanation, symbols without instruction, catalogs that record absence as carefully as presence. These traces do not clarify, they gesture. And gestures invite response. Some respond with scholarship, attempting to reconcile fragments across time. Others respond with reverence, treating the silence itself as meaningful. Still others respond creatively, allowing the unresolved to become symbolic. None of these responses restore the archive. They transform its absence. The mystery now lies less in what was lost and more in why the loss continues to matter. Centuries have passed, institutions have changed, yet the sense of something unfinished persists. You are asked to sit with that persistence. What remains constant is not content, but continuity of attention. The Templars are remembered because they do not conclude cleanly. Their records, dispersed and dormant, resist synthesis. The silence around them feels intentional even when it is inherited. This feeling sustains the echo. Each time the archive is referenced obliquely, it reinforces the sense that something was once whole and is now fragmented. Each omission deepens curiosity without satisfying it. The absence becomes part of the story rather than a gap in it. This is how unresolved history survives. Not through answers, but through endurance of questions. The archive does not return to speech. It does not reveal itself through sudden discovery. It remains what it has become over centuries of dormancy, a presence defined by what cannot be gathered. And so the mystery stabilizes. It is no longer sharp. It is not urgent. It is woven into cultural memory. Later generations stop expecting resolution. They accept the silence as part of inheritance. The echoes persist, not as clues, but as reminders of how history often behaves, leaving behind outlines rather than explanations. This chapter closes not with insight, but with recognition. Something once mattered enough to be recorded carefully, distributed widely, preserved selectively, and remembered unevenly. That something was never fully erased. It was never fully recovered either. It remains unresolved. And that unresolved quality is precisely what allows it to endure. Ahead lies a quieter turning inward, where interpretation becomes reflection, where symbols are weighed rather than pursued, and where the archive's silence begins to mirror the deeper uncertainties of memory itself. For now the echoes rest, not silent, not speaking, simply present. There comes a moment when the search outward slows, and attention turns gently inward. You are invited to rest here, not among documents or corridors, but within the space that opens when answers do not arrive. The archive, by now, has receded far enough that it no longer functions as a collection of records. It has become something else entirely, a reminder of limits. Human memory does not sit easily with gaps. When a story breaks off, the mind leans forward. When a record ends without explanation, imagination begins its quiet work. This is not a flaw, it is a feature of how meaning is formed. We do not encounter absence neutrally, we respond to it. You are asked to consider how symbols change in this environment. Once they belonged to systems of practice. They marked ownership, obligation, devotion. Now, separated from those systems, they function differently. They no longer instruct, they anchor. A symbol encountered without context does not explain itself, but it still resonates. It creates a feeling, familiarity, unease, reverence, curiosity. These responses arise before interpretation. They do not require certainty. This is where the archive now lives. Not in proof, but in response. The Templar fragments, real, partial, or imagined, become mirrors for the reader. What one sees in them depends not on what they contain, but on what the observer brings: longing for coherence, comfort with mystery, desire for meaning, tolerance for uncertainty. No single interpretation claims authority here. One reader approaches the silence with patience, accepting that some histories simply dissolve. Another feels compelled to imagine what might have been lost. A third treats the absence itself as the message. Each response is incomplete. Each is human. You are invited to notice how none of these reactions resolves the mystery. They coexist without canceling one another. The archive does not demand agreement. It accommodates multiplicity. This accommodation is quiet but powerful. Because it reveals something essential, not all knowledge is meant to be finished. Some histories function not as narratives but as boundaries, marking where understanding must slow. The archive becomes such a boundary. It reminds us that preservation has limits, that recovery is not guaranteed, that time does not owe us clarity. In this way, the silence left behind is not antagonistic, it is instructive. You are asked to sit with that instruction. Not everything that mattered survives in full. Not everything that survives can be fully understood. This does not diminish the past. It defines it. The chapter does not attempt to synthesize interpretations. It does not weigh them or reconcile them. To do so would impose closure where none exists. Instead, it allows them to remain side by side, partial, provisional, shaped by perspective. The mystery becomes participatory. Meaning is no longer something hidden to be uncovered. It is something formed in the act of reflection. The archive offers no final word. It offers a space in which thought can rest. And in that resting, something shifts. The urgency to resolve fades. The need to complete loosens. What remains is not answer, but awareness. Awareness of how humans relate to what they cannot finish. This is not an ending. It is a pause that deepens. Ahead, reflection will widen further. Toward questions of moral weight. Toward the responsibility carried by memory itself. And toward what it means to live with history that refuse to conclude. For now, remain here, with the quiet acceptance that not all mysteries are meant to close. As the urgency to explain recedes, something gentler takes its place. You are invited to notice how interpretation behaves when it is no longer driven by certainty. Without a single narrative to assemble, meanings begin to gather loosely, then drift apart again. They do not compete, they coexist. This is how unresolved histories are held. The archive by now is less a thing than a reference point. It exists not as a source of answers, but as a shared awareness of incompleteness. Those who encounter it, whether through fragments, echoes, or absence, do not stand before the same object. Each meets a different reflection. One reader senses reverence in the silence, another senses loss, a third senses restraint. None are incorrect because none claim completeness. You are asked to consider how this differs from resolution. Resolution narrows meaning. Interpretation widens it. In the absence of closure, symbols are no longer treated as clues. They become emotional anchors, points of orientation rather than destinations. A repeated mark, a familiar phrase, a name without explanation does not lead forward. It steadies the mind where it is. This steadiness matters. Human beings often seek certainty not because it is true, but because it is calming. Yet there is another kind of calm, one that comes from accepting ambiguity without resistance. This chapter lingers in that calm. The archive teaches this quietly. It does not insist on being understood. It does not demand retrieval. It simply remains incomplete, inviting the reader to adjust rather than resolve. The work shifts from uncovering content to observing response. You are invited to notice your own reaction. Do the gaps feel unsettling? Do they feel peaceful? Do they feel meaningful precisely because they remain open? These questions do not require answers. They mark presence. The mystery becomes participatory because meaning is now shaped by engagement rather than discovery. Each interpretation is formed in relation to the reader's expectations, experiences, and tolerance for uncertainty. This does not diminish historical seriousness. It deepens it. Because it acknowledges that the past cannot always be made whole without distortion. To force completion is to risk replacing what was with what is desired. Silence, by contrast, preserves integrity, even if it frustrates curiosity. You are asked to sit with this restraint, not as surrender, but as respect. Multiple interpretations remain possible precisely because none are finalized. The archive resists ownership by any single voice. It remains open, not because it lacks substance, but because its substance cannot be gathered into one frame. This openness is not chaotic. It is balanced. Each partial meaning holds just enough weight to matter, but not enough to dominate. Together, they form a field rather than a conclusion. In this field, the mystery does not sharpen. It softens. It becomes something one carries rather than solves, something that informs how we think about history, memory, and the limits of preservation. The chapter continues to slow here, allowing the mind to rest within ambiguity without seeking escape from it. Ahead lies a deeper consideration, not of interpretation, but of responsibility, of what it means to remember selectively, of the moral weight carried by what survives and what does not. For now, remain within this space where meanings gather and separate, where no single answer rises above the rest, and where the archive continues to exist, not as a puzzle, but as a quiet companion to thought. At some point, reflection settles into acceptance. You are invited to remain here in this final movement of the chapter, where the archive is no longer approached as something to be recovered, but as something to be lived with. The desire to complete the story has softened. What remains is attentiveness. Unfinished history does not disappear. It becomes part of how memory functions. The Templar archive, fragmented, dormant, echoed, serves as a reminder that not all knowledge survives intact. This reminder is not discouraging. It is grounding. It places boundaries around expectation and invites humility into interpretation. You are asked to notice how this changes the relationship between reader and past. When resolution is no longer demanded, the past is allowed to remain complex. Silence is not treated as a challenge to overcome, but as a condition to respect. The archive's gaps become markers of reality rather than failures of preservation. This is where interpretation becomes ethical. To accept uncertainty is to resist the urge to impose coherence where none exists. It is to acknowledge that meaning shaped by imagination alone risks replacing what was with what is wanted. The archive's silence protects against this substitution. Multiple interpretations continue to coexist, not as rivals but as companions. Each offers a way of relating to absence without claiming authority over it. Together, they reflect the diversity of human response to incomplete memory. You are invited to rest in this coexistence. No synthesis is required. No final statement is offered. The mystery remains participatory because it remains open. Meaning is not uncovered and set down. It is formed, then released, then formed again by the next reader. In this way, the archive becomes less a historical problem and more a mirror of human engagement with time. It shows how we approach what cannot be finished, how we carry unanswered questions without needing to resolve them. This carrying is not passive. It is attentive. It shapes how we think about preservation, authority, and the limits of understanding. It reminds us that survival of records does not guarantee survival of meaning, and that this gap is not always meant to be closed. The chapter rests here, not on loss but on restraint. The archive does not demand interpretation. It allows it. And in allowing it, it reveals something essential, that history is not only what is known, but also how we respond to what remains unknown. Ahead lies a final deepening, where reflection turns toward moral weight, toward responsibility, and toward the quiet consequences of forgetting. For now, the mystery remains exactly where it belongs, unfinished, unresolved, and gently present. Every archive, whether acknowledged or not, is shaped by decision. You are invited to slow your attention here, not toward accusation, but toward contemplation, toward the quiet weight carried by those, known and unknown, who determine what is preserved, what is set aside, and what is allowed to fade without resistance. No one makes these choices in a vacuum. Records survive because someone deemed them necessary. Others rest because they were no longer useful, no longer clear, or no longer safe to interpret. These decisions are rarely framed as moral acts, yet they shape the moral landscape of history all the same. You are asked to imagine the position of a custodian standing before shelves not infinite in space or resources. Time is limited. Attention is finite. Preservation requires prioritization. What should endure? What can be allowed to sleep? These are not questions answered once. They are answered repeatedly, often without reflection, through habit, policy, and inherited practice. Sometimes forgetting protects. A fragment taken out of context can do harm. A record misunderstood can destabilize belief, identity, or order. Silence in such cases becomes a form of care. To refrain from circulation is to prevent distortion. To allow dormancy is to protect meaning from misuse. At other times, forgetting diminishes. When a record fades, so does the complexity it carried. Voices become quieter. Relationships flatten. History narrows. What remains may be orderly, but it may also be incomplete in ways that cannot be measured. Often forgetting does both at once. You are invited to sit with this tension without resolving it. The buried archive, real, partial, or symbolic, comes to represent this fragile balance. Its absence is not simply loss. Its presence is not simply preservation. It occupies a space between, where responsibility is felt but never fully articulated. Those who curate memory rarely imagine future readers. They act for the present, guided by stability rather than speculation. Their choices feel practical, even necessary. Only later do these choices acquire ethical weight. History does not preserve intention. It preserves outcome. You are asked to consider how much of what we know survives not because it was most important, but because it was most compatible with the systems that carried it forward. What did not fit quietly receded. This does not imply injustice. It implies limitation. Human systems cannot hold everything. Selection is unavoidable. The moral question lies not in the act of choosing, but in how lightly or heavily that choice is held. The archive's thinning reminds us of this. What we inherit is shaped by countless small decisions made without awareness of their long reach. Silence accumulates not through design, but through repetition. And yet silence carries consequence. Later generations sense absence and feel its weight without knowing its origin. They inherit not only what survived, but the shape of what did not. This shape influences understanding as much as content ever could. The chapter does not seek to assign fault. It invites awareness. To recognize that preservation is not neutral, that forgetting is not always failure, that history is fragile not because it breaks, but because it is always incomplete. This recognition deepens the quiet. It prepares the mind not for resolution, but for return, to the beginning, to the silence itself, to the understanding that what remains unsaid is often as formative as what is recorded. Silence is not a single thing. You are invited to consider its different shapes, how it can shelter and how it can erode, sometimes at the same time. The absence left by forgotten records does not speak with one voice. It carries multiple consequences, depending on how it is encountered. Sometimes silence guards. A record preserved without circulation remains intact, protected from misuse. A fragment allowed to rest avoids being bent into narratives it cannot support. In these cases, forgetting functions as restraint. It prevents harm by limiting interpretation. Institutions often understand this intuitively. They choose not to activate certain materials because activation would require certainty they do not possess. Silence becomes a form of humility, an admission that some things cannot be handled safely. But silence can also wound. When records fade, so do perspectives. The narrowing of memory simplifies history, often unintentionally. Nuance disappears first. What remains feels clean but incomplete. Complexity gives way to clarity, and clarity can mislead. You are asked to notice how easily this happens. A ledger lost removes not only transactions but relationships. A correspondence absent erases dialogue. A symbol misunderstood becomes decorative rather than meaningful. Each loss is small, yet cumulative. Over time, the moral weight of forgetting becomes visible not in what is missing, but in how what remains is understood. History begins to appear more certain than it was. Lines harden. Stories simplify. The past becomes easier to narrate but less accurate in its texture. This is not done deliberately. It emerges from necessity. Human systems favor coherence. They struggle with ambiguity. When faced with fragments, they often prefer to build around them rather than preserve the gap. Silence is filled with assumption, sometimes unconsciously. The buried archive resists this tendency by remaining unresolved. Its absence does not allow easy completion. It reminds us that something was lost or set aside, and that this loss matters, even if we cannot name what it was. This reminder introduces humility into interpretation. You are invited to sit with that humility. It does not demand recovery. It does not insist on explanation. It simply asks that we acknowledge the limits of what we know. For those who curate memory, this acknowledgement is heavy. To preserve is to choose. To forget is also to choose. Both acts shape understanding far beyond their immediate context. The moral weight lies not in the outcome alone, but in the ongoing responsibility to recognize that outcome's partial nature. The chapter lingers here, within this recognition. Silence is neither virtue nor failure by default. It is a condition that must be held carefully. What is forgotten may have been protected. What is protected may have been diminished. These truths do not cancel each other. They coexist, just as interpretations coexist within unresolved history. As you remain here, the contemplative tone deepens. The narrative does not rush toward judgment. It allows the complexity to remain intact. Ahead lies the final movement. Not toward answer, but toward return. Toward the silence that began the journey. Now understood not as absence, but as a space shaped by countless human hands. At last, the reflection turns inward once more. You are invited to consider not only the custodians of memory, but those who inherit what they leave behind. Every generation receives a version of the past already shaped by forgetting. What is known arrives alongside what is missing, and both carry weight. This weight is rarely acknowledged directly. Most of the time, history is treated as solid ground. We walk upon it without questioning how it was laid. Yet beneath that surface lies a network of decisions, some intentional, some habitual, that determined which records endured and which dissolved into silence. The buried archive becomes a symbol of this condition. It reminds us that knowledge is fragile not because it is easily destroyed, but because it is selectively preserved. What survives does so by fitting into systems that outlast individuals. What does not fit quietly recedes. You are asked to notice how this awareness changes the way absence feels. It is no longer a void to be filled, but a presence to be respected. The moral quiet of this chapter does not lead to instruction. It does not urge recovery or correction. Instead, it invites attentiveness, an ethical posture toward history that acknowledges incompleteness without rushing to compensate for it. This posture carries responsibility. To read history attentively is to remember that silence often has origins in care as well as in loss. That what we do not know may have been shielded as much as forgotten, that every archive reflects the constraints of its time. This understanding does not absolve forgetting. It contextualizes it. The archive's thinning was not a single act, nor a single choice. It was a process unfolding across centuries, shaped by need, fear, caution, and habit. Its moral weight lies in its endurance. Later generations feel this weight not as guilt, but as uncertainty. They sense that something once mattered deeply enough to be preserved, distributed, and then allowed to sleep. They feel the outline of that importance without grasping its form. This feeling prepares the mind for return, not to resolution, but to origin. The narrative does not close here. It circles back toward the beginning, toward the silence that framed the archive before it was named, before it was dispersed, before it became a symbol. The moral question remains open, as it must. What should be preserved? What should be allowed to fade? And how lightly can we hold the answers to both? As you rest with these questions, notice how the tone softens further. The journey is nearing its end, not with certainty but with awareness. Ahead lies a final stillness, where the archive is no longer traced through time, but allowed to remain exactly where it has always been, within the long pause of history itself. You are brought back, not forward, not toward discovery, not toward explanation, but toward the place where the journey first slowed into quiet. Imagine again the stone steps, worn smooth by centuries of passing feet. They descend not into darkness but into a cooler stillness. The air feels unchanged, as if it has been waiting rather than abandoned. Nothing announces itself here. Nothing resists your presence. The archive is no longer something you are searching for. It has become the space itself. You are invited to stand at the threshold without crossing it, to notice how the silence does not feel empty but shaped, formed by years of careful placement, selective memory, and deliberate restraint. The walls do not speak, yet they hold the impression of voices that once passed through. This is where the journey turns inward one final time. The records that once mattered, charters, ledgers, symbols, are no longer imagined as objects stacked behind doors. They are felt as absences within continuity, as sentences that end without resolution, as catalogs that reference without elaborating. Institutions remember, but they do not always explain. This remembering is not incomplete. It is restrained. You are asked to sense how different this feels from loss. Loss implies something taken away. What you encounter here was never fully accessible to begin with. It was placed carefully, allowed to rest, and then carried forward through silence. The archive has not vanished. It has become ambient. It exists in the pauses between what is known, in the gentle hesitation before interpretation, in the awareness that history does not always conclude its thoughts. You are invited to rest with that awareness, not to solve it, not to disturb it, simply to acknowledge it. The stone walls, the sealed rooms, the quiet air, they are no longer barriers. They are reminders. They signal that some histories endure not because they are fully preserved, but because they resist final articulation. This resistance is not defiance. It is endurance. What was buried was not erased. What was sealed was not silenced. It remains where it has always been, within the long pause that follows careful memory. As you linger here, the need for resolution dissolves. The archive does not require discovery to exist. Its presence is felt precisely because it remains unfinished. This is the final return. Ahead, there is no next movement, only continuation of the same stillness. The silence settles not as an ending, but as a condition. And within that condition, the archive waits. Not hidden, not revealed, but held gently within time itself. As you remain at the threshold, something subtle begins to shift. Not in the space around you, but in how you sense it. The archive, once traced through centuries of movement and change, now feels still enough to listen to. Its silence is no longer something to interpret. It becomes something to inhabit. You are invited to notice how absence itself can feel full, dense with implication, yet free of demand. Records that end mid-sentence no longer feel incomplete. They feel honest. They acknowledge the limits of what could be carried forward. A catalog entry without elaboration does not frustrate here. It marks restraint, not failure. Institutions that remember without explaining are no longer distant. They appear patient. You begin to understand that silence has been doing the work all along. It protected fragile meanings from distortion. It allowed continuity without forcing coherence. It carried forward what could not safely speak. The archive has not been waiting to be recovered. It has been waiting to be recognized as silence. You are invited to reflect on how rarely this happens in history. How often absence is treated as error, as concealment, as loss to be repaired. Yet here, absence has been preserved deliberately, not always consciously but consistently. This preservation does not announce itself. It does not defend itself. It simply endures. As centuries layered upon one another, the archive learned how to survive without visibility. It withdrew from explanation not to provoke curiosity, but to avoid misinterpretation. What remained unsaid was allowed to remain intact. And intact does not mean complete. It means unforced. The silence here feels different now, no longer heavy with unanswered questions but steady with acceptance. The mystery has not been solved, yet it no longer presses. It has become part of the landscape, like stone shaped by weather rather than tools. You are asked to rest in this shift, to notice how the archive's absence has become a kind of presence, one that shapes how history is approached, how memory is held, how uncertainty is tolerated. The questions remain, but they no longer demand answers. They breathe alongside you, part of the same quiet that fills the room. This is not forgetting. It is not concealment. It is acknowledgement of limits. The archive endures here not as an object behind doors, but as a shared pause across time, a space where meaning was allowed to stop without being destroyed. And as you remain within this pause, you sense that the journey has not led away from the archive at all. It has led into it. There is nothing more to descend into. The steps end not at a chamber but at stillness itself. The sealed rooms do not open, yet they do not resist. They remain as they have always been, present without invitation, silent without refusal. You are not meant to enter them. You are meant to stand where you are. Here, the archive completes its transformation. It is no longer imagined as shelves or chests, as parchment or seals. It has become a condition of history, a way in which memory chooses to endure by not insisting on being spoken. Its silence is not fragile. It has survived centuries precisely because it does not need defense. You are invited to feel how different this is from erasure. Erasure leaves scars. Silence leaves continuity. The archive has not been removed from the world. It has been absorbed into it. Its presence is felt in how institutions hesitate before explanation, in how records sometimes end without summary, in how questions are allowed to remain unanswered without anxiety. This is not neglect. It is maturity. Histories that endure longest are often those that resist completion. They do not close themselves neatly. They allow future generations to approach them slowly, without expectation of mastery. The buried archive belongs to this kind of history. It remains because it was never forced to speak beyond its capacity. It was allowed to rest when explanation risked distortion. It was carried forward by restraint rather than revelation. You are asked to rest with this understanding. Not everything meaningful must be recovered. Not everything preserved must be explained. Some histories endure not through survival of content, but through survival of space, the space where interpretation slows and humility enters. The silence around the archive has become its final form. It is no longer a question mark. It is a pause. Within this pause, memory is held gently, not sharpened into certainty, not dissolved into myth, simply held intact in its incompleteness. As the quiet settles fully now, there is no sense of loss. There is only continuity. The same continuity that guided the earliest archivists, the same restraint that shaped institutional care, the same patience that allowed fragments to endure without demand. The archive remains where it has always been. Not behind walls, not beneath stone, but within the long, unbroken pause of time itself. And as you remain here, nothing asks to be concluded, nothing asks to be solved. The silence does not close, it continues.